Hey, we're gonna get started again. Okay, so given the time, so first of all, I would say, loved the degree of engagement in that first section. That was awesome. Round of applause for all of you. Love that. We love engaged energetic, especially in the morning of VII. Given that the study lab leaders a minute ago, it seems like value for us to keep going. We are going to compensate for it by kind of truncating the copyright and trademark portions of this. For now, we're going to talk a little about them very briefly. That I think makes sense in part because, in a lot, I mean, no disrespect to copyright and trademark lawyers, and I'm sure there's like a ton of stuff to litigate about both of them, but they are in some important ways kind of more conceptually straightforward, less in the weeds. More importantly, as it relates to your kind of immediate short-term interests, they are, I think, I would anticipate, we'll see, knock on wood, but I would guess that like 90% of your debates this year, if not more, will be about the patent area rather than these others. There are a mix of reasons for that. One big part of that is that it's much easier to produce an affirmative that kind of a self-advocate that like plausibly solves some meaningful large harm, whether it's like competing China or disruptive innovation in the U.S. economy or whatever, for patents, given that they protect these kind of like core technological innovations, the structure of our economy, et cetera, than it is for copyright and trademark. So definitely think it's kind of most important for you all to have a handle on that. We will still talk some about copyright and trademark, both how they work and also about some potential examples of apps when it gets to the topic breakdown piece. And then in the event that you all are interested, we were talking a minute ago, we haven't figured out the exact structure of this, but we'll probably offer an elective down the road or whatever for any of you who want to like deep dive more on those couple of areas. But before we get into any of that, there are some important patent things that we need to wrap up. There's plenty more that could be said here, but the two things that I want us to be sure that we cover, because you will definitely encounter them, probably even imminently, like the first thing we're going to talk about here bears directly on the set of debates you all will have about the AI inventor app, for instance. So the first thing is POSITA or POSITA, P-O-S-I-T-A or P-H-O-S-I-T-A. You'll see both acronyms used. Those respectively stand for person of ordinary skill in the art, or person having ordinary skill in the art. This is, so I should have first said, we're picking up the thread where we left off in terms of requirements for patentability, right? So we talked about the thing has to be novel. It needs to be useful / have utility. I didn't really elaborate on that one earlier, so I will kind of briefly say here what we mean when we say that is that it, like the phrase you'll hear a lot is that it needs to, quote unquote, have been reduced to practice. What we mean by that is that it can't be merely an idea. Conception is not really a separate one of these requirements. It is instead usually inserted as a component of that utility piece. It can be sometimes folded in other parts of the analysis, whatever. But like earlier you'll notice the three requirements I wrote were like novel, utility, non-obvious. Conception, sort of a distinct thing that's kind of like hanging around in there, but this also speaks to some of the questions that people have floated earlier about like, what if it was just an initial idea or whatever. You only really conceive of the thing when it's like, here is a thing that is new, here is broadly kind of how it would work, here's the impact it would have. Once you are the person who has cooked up that idea, you are the inventor. And then we have the non-obviousness inquiry, and that which is like step 3, or not step, but third prong of that analysis, and that is where this comes in. So we have this question of like, is the thing obvious or not? That begs the question, obvious to whom? Answer, person who has ordinary skill in the art. Does anyone have any initial notion of what that means? One of you, I think you were the one who earlier kind of floated something in this direction. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about it.
I think it's like, just like if it was a pharmaceutical drug, like your average pharmacist, would they already know that this is like something that exists, or it's not novel?
Right, so the answer given here was, if it's a pharmaceutical drug with something in that field, would somebody in that field find it obvious or not, / would it seem novel to them, rather than just like your average person on the street, right? Which makes far more sense as the standard we're applying, especially in technical fields, but really, in any field, once you're at this level of depth, is highly technical. It doesn't make any sense for us to be like, as long as like Joe Schmo doesn't know what this thing is, it's not obvious. Instead, the relevant question is, other people who are active in that area, would they readily think of this thing and be like, yeah, of course, if so, it's not an idea that's patentable. If no, then it potentially might be. One thing I will say is the example you gave a minute ago is you were like, in the pharmaceutical context, it would be your average pharmacist. That might be the relevant point of inquiry, or it might not be, right? There's an important kind of subsidiary question here that's like, who is the person of ordinary skill in the art? What is the relevant metric or not metric? What's the relevant index for that in a given context, right? How do we define that in a given situation? I don't know if this is a productive, probably not. I'll say it anyway. Probably won't be helpful for any of you. I know for like one of you in case three. In antitrust law, which was a college shop a couple of years ago, there's a sort of analogous, in some ways, question about like how do you define the relevant market you're competing in, right? It's like, are you competing against other iPhones? Are you competing against smartphones in general? Whatever, right? This is sort of a similar thing where it's like, is the person who has ordinary skill in the art a pharmacist? Is it somebody involved in the formulation of pharmaceutical drugs? Is it, and so there are an important set of questions kind of growing out of that. The way that a lot of this intersects with bears on the AI patent path, just so you all have some kind of initial priming in this direction. I'm not gonna I think for the most part, any kind of deeper dive on that stuff should occur in those labs and stuff, so I won't get too deep on this, but I will briefly say two of the major questions regarding AI inventorship, and like whether AI can, AI produces an invention, what do we do with that? Are first, to what degree can AI conceive of a thing? And if you produce or program or whatever an AI, at what point have you done all the legwork necessary to say that actually it was you who conceived of it, just via the tool that is the AI? And second, a kind of meaningfully separate but also very big question is, how does increasing uptake of AI throughout different industries change what counts as obvious, right? Because one of the things that's really awesome about AI is all of a sudden it's much easier for us to come up with a bunch of different ideas quickly, index large bodies of knowledge, bring it to bear in kind of new, sophisticated, structured and unstructured ways. So is the relevant question would a human person who is very experienced in that field find this thing obvious, kind of on their own devices? Or is the relevant question, if you gave them ChatGPT and let them play with it for a while and try to figure out an answer to this question, would they find it obvious? Because the bar, to some degree today, but increasingly over the next couple of years, the bar for the latter is likely to be much, much higher for getting a patent than the bar for the former, right? In the sense that it's going to be much easier to quickly and cheaply come up with new ideas as we increasingly integrate AI tools, which might be a feature, might be a bug, right? There are upsides to that. It being harder to get a patent in that context is counterbalanced by the fact that it's so much easier to engage in that inventive activity to begin with, right? So maybe what we want is actually to end up in a paradigm where historically we've needed patents to protect the set of stuff, and now we don't because we can innovate so quickly and easily that we should just set people loose with AI and trust that it'll work out. Or maybe not, or maybe there's some balance to be struck, maybe it depends on the given field, whatever. There are an important kind of complicated set of issues to be resolved there. So TLDR, person having ordinary skill of the art, not your average person, very field specific. There's a corresponding kind of subsidiary question, how should we understand the person and what counts as ordinary skill of the art or whatever, and in particular, how does that change as they get new tools that make stuff more readily obvious than it might have been previously? Does that make sense? Questions about that? Okay. The last patent thing I wanted us to be sure to touch on, because it initially is just total garble of acronyms and buzzwords, and you're almost certainly going to come across this repeatedly throughout this year, is what's called FRAND, F-R-A-N-D, which stands for fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licensing. And then some other acronyms that we'll also derive that we'll define as we go. I think that the best place to start here is not with list of definitions, but instead by kind of understanding the context that this idea grew out of, which is in the early to mid 20th century, we were kind of increasingly in this paradigm where people were engaging with innovative activity. They were receiving patents. Keep in mind, we said earlier that the point at which the statute that established the standards we've been talking about was passed in 1952, I think, 57, 52. And so this is prior to that point, where we're still kind of in some ways, it's sort of the Wild West of patent law. And there's a situation where there were a variety of groups of competitors that were patenting technologies that were necessary in order to be able to be very successful in a given field, and then just sitting on those patents and not refusing to license them to anyone. So we ended up in a situation where people were kind of creating de facto monopolies for themselves in various fields. One notable example of this, I don't remember the name of the case, but there was glass blowers were getting together and they were like, here are the processes that are necessary in order to kind of cost effectively at scale produce a bunch of high quality glass. And they were they patented those, and then whenever somebody would try to become a glass blower, they couldn't use for the next 20 years any of those necessary kind of current generation industrial processes. And so you ended up with these kind of incumbent monopolies who are we as a result don't really have any incentive to innovate. We can charge whatever prices we want for blowing glass because no one else can come in and challenge us. And so that gave rise to this premise of FRAND licensing, which is, again, rooted in the idea that that kind of thing should not be allowed to happen. The way that we do that is there are things called SSOs, or SDOs. There may be some distinction between them, but I know that they're often used interchangeably, so it is at minimum square rectangle. It might just be relative synonyms. Don't quote me on which of the two. Standard, or SDO stands for Standard Developing Organizations. SSO stands for Standard Setting Organizations. These are industry groups that establish what the technical standards are in a given field to ensure interoperability, to ensure kind of industry best practices. They serve a variety of different purposes. So you can think here both of tech groups coming together and being USB is now going to be a thing, right? All of you have USB ports. You can go to any store and be I'm purchasing a USB to whatever kind of adapter / port. That did not have to be true. It could be the case that each individual computer manufacturer is doing the thing that Apple was able to get away with for a while there, and it's not as much anymore. In large part because the EU of we're going to have our own proprietary things, right? It's we're each going to have our own version of the Lightning 2 cable or whatever, which would be a nightmare. And for a variety of reasons, and using a variety of different legal tools, including antitrust stuff and whatever, the government has kind of steered and has advised people away from that. And so to prevent